Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. For 17 years, my life was a blueprint. I was the chief architect at a firm called Innovate Structures, but I was more than just an employee. I was the first one hired by the founder, a brilliant, old-school gentleman named Mr. Harrison. We didn't just build a company, we built a reputation, stone by meticulous stone. Our foundation wasn't just concrete and steel, it was integrity, innovation, and a fanatical devotion to quality. My creation, the software that ran the entire company, was called Keystone. It wasn't just a program, it was the central nervous system of our entire operation. It managed everything from structural analysis and material sourcing to client management and project timelines. I wrote the first lines of its code in my garage on weekends, long before Mr. Harrison even had an office. It was my life's work, my professional soul, and it was the engine that drove our success. I was loyal to a fault. I worked through weekends, I missed anniversaries, I poured my entire being into that company because I believed in what we were building. Mr. Harrison wasn't just a boss, he was a mentor, a partner. He promised me that my sweat equity, my unwavering commitment would one day translate into a real partnership. He was a man of his word. But men, even the best of them, are mortal. When Mr. Harrison passed away 2 years ago, the company fell to his son, a man named Sterling. Sterling was everything his father was not. He was slick, with an MBA from a school that taught him the language of synergy and optimization, but nothing about loyalty or the soul of a company. He saw my quiet, heads-down dedication not as a strength, but as a quaint, outdated relic. He saw me as a piece of old furniture in his sleek, modern office. Then came the nephew, Parker. He was the owner's nephew, Sterling's cousin, a young man with a freshly printed business degree, a smug sense of entitlement, and the professional competence of a potted plant. Sterling gave him a fancy title and a corner office, and I spent the next year quietly cleaning up his messes, correcting his catastrophic errors, and redoing his work in the dead of night to protect our clients from his incompetence. I didn't complain. I did the work. I thought my loyalty, my indispensability, would be my shield. I was a fool. The invitation to lunch came on a Monday. It was from Sterling himself. It was at a ridiculously expensive restaurant, the kind where the waiters speak in hushed whispers and the menus don't have prices. I assumed it was about the Ethelgard Global Project, our biggest client, a multi-billion-dollar account that I personally managed. I thought it was a promotion, a bonus, perhaps finally the partnership Mr. Harrison had promised me. I walked in feeling a rare sense of optimism. Sterling was already there, a shark in a tailored suit, a predatory smile on his face. He was charming, he was effusive, he ordered the most expensive bottle of wine. We made small talk. He praised my years of service, my dedication. He was buttering me up, leading me to the slaughter. Then, after the main course had been cleared, he leaned forward, his smile gone, replaced by a look of cool, clinical detachment. He told me the company was moving in a new strategic direction. He spoke of fresh energy and a new generation of leadership. And then he told me that my position was being eliminated, effective immediately. I was being fired. I just sat there, the sound of the restaurant fading into a dull roar in my ears. I asked him why. After 17 years of flawless service, of building his father's legacy, I deserved to know why. It's not personal, he said, the foremost insulting words in the English language. We just feel that Parker is ready to step up and take on more responsibility. He'll be taking over your role as head of project development. Parker, the incompetent, lazy child who couldn't even manage his own expense reports. I was being replaced by the owner's nephew. It was the oldest, ugliest story in the corporate world. He slid a thin envelope across the table, a severance package. It was an insult, a pittance, a go-away check designed to ensure my silence. He told me security would escort me to my old office to collect my personal belongings. He wished me the best of luck in my future endeavors. Then he looked at his watch and said he had another meeting. He left me sitting there, alone at a table with a half-empty glass of wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. I had been invited to lunch only to be executed. I walked out of that restaurant in a daze. I didn't go back to the office. I didn't want the humiliation of being watched as I packed up 17 years of my life. They could keep the stupid ficus plant in the coffee mug. As I stood on the street, the city moving around me in a blur, the shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, quiet, and absolutely surgical rage. Sterling and his useless nephew thought they had just trimmed some dead wood from their corporate tree. They thought they had gotten rid of an old, sentimental piece of furniture. They didn't realize they had just fired the architect. They didn't realize that the software I had created, the keystone that was the very foundation of their entire company, was not a corporate asset. They didn't realize that the patents, the copyrights, the very intellectual property of their central nervous system were all in my name. They hadn't just fired me. They had just given me the loaded gun, and they had no idea I was about to pull the trigger. The first 48 hours after the lunch were a period of forced, unnatural calm. I went home to my quiet apartment and I did nothing. I didn't answer the increasingly frantic calls from my former colleagues or the cold procedural emails from HR. I was a ghost. I let them complete the process of my erasure. I let them remove my name from the directory, disable my email, and tell the rest of the staff that I had decided to pursue other opportunities. I needed them to believe they were in complete control, that their little coup had been a success. While they were busy congratulating themselves, I was in my home study, pulling out a dusty, forgotten file from the bottom of my filing cabinet. The file was labeled Keystone Origins. Inside were the documents that were about to become the most important things in my life. The original copyright and patent filings for the Keystone software, all dated years before Innovate Structures was even a registered corporation. All filed under one name, mine. The story was simple. I had created Keystone on my own time, on my own equipment. When Mr. Harrison, a man I respected and trusted, offered me a job, I had brought my creation with me. We had a gentleman's agreement, a handshake deal born of mutual respect. I would grant his company an exclusive, indefinite license to use my software in exchange for a leadership role and the promise of a future partnership. In the heady, optimistic early days of building a business from scratch, we had never formalized the transfer of intellectual property. He was a man of his word, and I was a young man who valued loyalty over legal jargon. It was a massive, foolish oversight, the kind of mistake you only make when you trust someone completely. And now, that mistake was about to become my salvation. Sterling, with his MBA and his team of slick lawyers, had inherited a company whose most valuable asset was something it didn't even own. They had a license, born of a handshake deal with a dead man, to use my software. A license I was now in a perfect legal position to revoke. My next step was to understand the full extent of my leverage. Keystone wasn't just an internal tool, it was the product we sold. Our biggest client, Ethelgard Global, a massive international construction conglomerate, didn't just use our firm for our designs. They used us because their entire worldwide operation was built on the Keystone platform. Their multi-million-dollar annual contract was not just for our services, but for the ongoing support and maintenance of the software I had built, and I alone truly understood. And my relationship with Ethelgard was personal. I had spent a decade working with their head of global infrastructure, a brilliant, no-nonsense woman named Isabelle Dubois. Our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual professional respect. She trusted me, my expertise, and my software. She barely even knew who Sterling was. He was just the founder's son who signed the checks. The plan began to form, not as a messy, emotional act of revenge, but as a clean, corporate-style maneuver. It was a language Sterling would understand. I would not sue for wrongful termination. I would not fight for my old job. I would simply reclaim what was legally mine. And in doing so, I would gut his company from the inside out. I spent a week with a top-tier intellectual property lawyer, a man who, upon reviewing my documents, looked at me with the kind of delighted, predatory smile a wolf gives a lamb. He confirmed what I already knew. My position was unassailable. I was the sole legal owner of the code, the patents, and the copyrights for the Keystone software. The license Innovate Structures was operating under was based on a verbal agreement that had, for all legal purposes, died with Mr. Harrison. We drafted a letter. It was a beautiful, terrifying document. It was a formal notice of license revocation, informing Innovate Structures that their legal right to use, sell, or access the Keystone software in any capacity would be terminated in 30 days. 30 days. It was a corporate death sentence. They had 30 days to replace their entire operational infrastructure, a task that would take years and cost millions. But I wasn't finished. Before I had my lawyer send that letter, I made a call. I called Isabelle Dubois at Ethelgard Global. It was a courtesy call. It was a strategic masterstroke. I told her, calmly and professionally, what had happened. I told her I had been fired and replaced by the owner's nephew. I told her that, as the legal owner of the Keystone software, I would be revoking Innovate Structures' license. And then I made my pitch. I told her I was starting my own small specialized consultancy, just me, and that I would be honored to offer Ethelgard Global a new, direct, and more cost-effective license for the software they depended on, complete with my personal, uninterrupted support. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her processing the information, the sheer, beautiful corporate insanity of it all. "Let me get this straight," she finally said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning icy fury. "Sterling fired the one man who owns the software his entire company and my entire global operation runs on and replaced him with his incompetent nephew?" "That is an accurate summary of the situation," I replied. I didn't need to say another word. I had not just given her a problem. I had given her the solution. And in doing so, I had not just taken back my software. I was about to take their biggest client. I told my lawyer to send the letter. The clock was now ticking. The 30-day notice was a declaration of war, delivered not with a shout, but with the quiet, devastating formality of a legal document. I pictured the scene in Sterling's glass-walled office. The confusion, the dismissive laughter, then the dawning, stomach-churning horror as his own lawyers explained the catastrophic reality of their situation. They had not just fired an employee, they had evicted the landlord, and now he was changing the locks. While they were scrambling, I was building. I incorporated my new consultancy. I called it Keystone IP Solutions. It was a simple, honest name that stated exactly what I was. I was the solution. I didn't need a fancy office or a team of employees. My assets were in my head and on my hard drives. My first and only client was Ethelgard Global. Isabelle Dubois was true to her word. She was a woman who valued competence and despised unprofessionalism. The story of my firing and of Sterling's nepotistic foolishness had solidified her decision. She fast-tracked a new multi-year, multi-million-dollar contract directly with my one-man company. The contract was for significantly less than what Innovate Structures had been charging her, a fact that not only saved her company millions, but also served as a beautiful final insult to Sterling. She was getting a better product, the creator himself, for a better price. While my future was solidifying, Innovate Structures was beginning to crumble. My lawyer, who was now gleefully handling all communications, gave me the highlights. The first response from them was a blizzard of legal threats, a desperate, blustering attempt to intimidate me. They accused me of theft, of breach of contract, of everything they could think of. My lawyer responded to their 20-page diatribe with a simple 2-sentence letter, attaching a copy of my original patent filing and wishing them the best of luck. Their second response was a panicked, desperate attempt to build a replacement for Keystone from scratch. They threw money at a team of outside developers, promising them impossible deadlines. But Keystone was not a simple program. It was 17 years of my life, a complex, layered ecosystem of code that I had built and refined piece by piece. Trying to replicate it in a month was like trying to build a cathedral in a week with a handful of amateurs. It was a fool's errand, and it was costing them a fortune. The final and most predictable phase of their collapse was the call from Sterling. He didn't call my lawyer, he called my personal cell phone, a number I had not changed. His voice was not the voice of the confident, arrogant CEO who had fired me over lunch. It was the voice of a drowning man. He started with an apology, a pathetic, transparently false string of words about a terrible misunderstanding. He told me there had been a miscommunication about my role. He offered me my job back. He offered me a promotion, a massive raise, a corner office. "Whatever you want, Elias," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can make this right. Just tell me what you want." I let him finish his frantic, humiliating pitch. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment. "What I want, Sterling," I finally said, my voice calm and devoid of emotion, "is for you to understand the lesson your father tried to teach you. A company's greatest asset isn't its brand or its market share. It's the people who build it. You fired the architect and gave the blueprints to a child, and now the building is falling down. This is a structural failure of your own design." He started to stammer, to make promises, to offer me a partnership, the very thing his father had promised me all those years ago. "It's too late for that, Sterling," I said. "You see, my new company has just signed its first major client, a company called Aita Global. They were very impressed with my new streamlined business model. It turns out they were happy to pay for the software, but they were tired of paying for the dead weight." I could hear his sharp, strangled intake of breath on the other end of the line. I had not just taken back my software, I had taken his crown jewel. I had taken the client that represented nearly 60% of his company's annual revenue. The silence that followed was the sound of a man realizing that he was not just losing a battle, he had already lost the war. "It was never personal, Sterling," I said, using his own words, the final perfect twist of the knife. "It's just business." And then I hung up. I had not raised my voice. I had not sworn or threatened. I had simply presented him with the consequences of his own actions, a final, devastating project report on his own failure. My work was done. I sat in my quiet home study, the same room where I had written the first lines of code for Keystone all those years ago. The wheel had come full circle. He had tried to erase my past, and in doing so, he had handed me my future. The final 30 days of Innovate Structures were a quiet, spectacular implosion. With Aita Global gone, and with the impending legal and technical nightmare of losing their core software, their other clients began to flee like rats from a sinking ship. The company's reputation, which Mr. Harrison and I had spent nearly 2 decades building, was destroyed in a month by the arrogance and incompetence of his son. The news of their collapse was not something I followed with glee, but with a kind of detached academic interest. It was the logical conclusion of a flawed design. The company was eventually sold for parts, its assets liquidated for pennies on the dollar to a larger competitor. Sterling was forced out in disgrace, his brief, disastrous reign as CEO a case study in how to destroy a legacy. And Parker, the nephew, the catalyst for the entire catastrophe, was the first one to be let go by the new owners. He was, as he had always been, useless. My new life, in contrast, was a study in quiet, focused success. My consultancy, Keystone IP Solutions, thrived. With Aita Global as my anchor client, I was able to be selective. I took on a handful of other projects, working not for the money, but for the challenge, for the love of the work. I was no longer a manager, no longer a corporate drone. I was a craftsman again. I worked from my home, on my own schedule. I had no employees, no board meetings, no corporate politics. I had my work, my integrity, and my freedom. The money, which was now more substantial than I had ever dreamed of, was a byproduct, not the goal. It was a tool, one that allowed me to live a life of quiet independence, the very life Sterling had so arrogantly tried to take from me. About 6 months after the collapse, I received a letter. It was from a law firm, but it wasn't a threat. It was an inquiry. It was from a group of former Innovate Structures employees, the good ones, the talented designers and engineers who had been laid off during the implosion. They had an idea. They wanted to start a new firm, a small, employee-owned cooperative built on the principles that Mr. Harrison had originally championed. They weren't asking for a handout. They were asking for a partner. They were asking for Keystone. I met with them in a small coffee shop, a world away from the fancy restaurant where Sterling had fired me. They were a team of brilliant, passionate people who had been betrayed by the same corporate rot that had betrayed me. They had a vision, not of growth and profit, but of quality and sustainability. They wanted to build something that would last. I thought about it for a long time. I could have continued on my own, a lone wolf, successful and secure. But Mr. Harrison had taught me that the best structures are built not by one person, but by a team. I made my decision. I licensed the Keystone software to them for the symbolic price of $1 a year. And I joined them, not as a CEO or a boss, but as a senior advisor, a mentor, the architect returning to help a new generation of builders lay a better foundation. Our new firm is small, but it is strong. It is built on a foundation of mutual respect. And sometimes, when I'm working late in our new shared office, the quiet hum of creation around me, I think about Sterling and his nephew. They invited me to lunch to fire me. They thought they were ending my story. They had no idea they were just writing the prologue to a much better one. This was Reddit Whispers. Stories heal when they're shared. What moment in your life still echoes in your mind? Write it below. We're listening.